Welcome to the Intelligent Teams podcast, where we interview leading thinkers from business and the sciences of mind to find new ways to help your teams and organizations thrive. I'm your host, Daniel Susser. James Pereira KC is an award-winning barrister and professional performance coach for individuals and organizations. He is a co-founder of the Libra Partnership, which specializes in supporting lawyers, law firms, and the bar, providing lawyers and law firms with next-generation skills that they need now: self-awareness and self-mastery, enhanced communication skills, deep understanding of relationships, systemic awareness, and creative ways to find solutions. He's coached in multinational law firms, government law departments, the in-house sector and barristers' chambers, as well as working with individual lawyers at the bar and in the city. Welcome, James, to Intelligent Teams.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us a bit about what you do and how you got there, James?
Yeah, so I kind of do what you've described, I guess. I suppose if you were to ask me what most of my coaching time is spent doing, it's really in the realm of, I guess people come to me with problems, with challenges, work challenges, whether they're individuals or people sent by their organisation. And normally, my experience is their work challenge tracks back to a personal issue, usually arising from family upbringing. And so I tend to work a lot in that space of one might call it a bridge, right, between personal dynamics and patterns that have been learned, and then how they present in the workplace. But in a way, it's kind of not a bridge; it's a complete seamless layering instead. So a lot of my work is about raising awareness about what patterns are activated, why and when, how they can be useful, when they're not useful, and then finding out ways to kind of loosen them, and then in the space that's created by that, build different skills and different tools. And I think you asked me how I got into it. So I started at the bar in 1996. I still practice at the bar. I practice kind of full time, whatever that means. I don't know.
Maybe also for our audience who may not know the distinctions between the bar and different kinds of lawyer, could it give us a little overview of that as well, please?
It's really about dressing up, I think, is the main distinction. We get paid to wear wigs and gowns and prance around and stand up in court, and the barrister's really the advocate, right? The kind of classic idea of the guy wearing the wig or the woman wearing the wig and standing up in court, that kind of Victorian idea. That's what I do. But we're also a bit like in the medical profession where you have consultants. We're also specialist practitioners in certain areas. So I do planning, environmental, compensation, compulsory purchase, stuff like that. And law firms also have, as it happens, the right to do advocacy. And they also have specialist departments. It's just that the way the profession works is that the law firms tend to instruct people like me when there's a contentious matter or a particularly deep understanding or strategic advice needed. They come to me as a specialist. So there's that division. So the client goes to see the solicitor. The solicitor then says, "Oh, you need a barrister." They then come to see a barrister. It doesn't need to be that way, but that's just the way it is in this country. So I get paid to dress up, basically. That's the way I think about it during the week. And how did I get into it? So I started at the bar in 1996, and I worked very, very hard. And the bar has a culture of, we're all self-employed, so there's a kind of, in a sense, you're straight away put into your own pattern of what does work mean, what does success mean, what are the signs of capacity and ability. You know, there is a general bar culture, but because we're all individuals within that, there's quite a lot of looseness about what you see around you and what you absorb and what you imitate. Whereas if you go into an organization, you might be a lawyer, but depending on which firm you're in, the cultures may be quite different, right? So we don't really have that. There are chambers within the bar which have different cultures, but they all tend to follow a similar kind of bar pattern, which tends to be extremely long hours, an idea that you never make mistakes, a lot of perfectionism, a sense that the fate of the world rests upon your shoulders, a sense that when you win a case, you've won the case, which isn't the way, right? Because it depends upon so many other people. But of course, the flip side of that is when you lose a case, I've lost the case. And so the world can somehow, from 1 minute, seem expansive and beautiful and you're on the top of it, and in another minute it can be imploding upon you and you're at the bottom of it, depending on how things go. And there's a lot of that kind of psychology there. So I worked really hard and was very successful, won lots of prizes very quickly for my work, and then I took Silk in 2014, so quite juniorish. I was like 17, 18 years cool.
Taking Silk
Oh,
means...
sorry, that's really interesting. It's all about dressing up again. It means that you're allowed to wear a silk gown rather than a woolen gown. But what it actually means is you're called a QC if there's a Queen's Counsel, or KC now, King's Counsel, which is just really I don't know specifically the history of it, but it's really a sign that you've reached the higher level of the profession. So you're brought on in big cases, instructed on the kind of heavyweight stuff. You can bring in other people in your team.
So it's like going from a mid-level doctor to becoming a consultant or
Yeah,
something like that.
or becoming a partner in a firm, something like that. And in that same year, 2014, I burnt out. I got divorced. I left home, had a horrible split up, and I basically, although the outside world didn't see it really, but in my private life, I kind of came off the rails, to be honest. Kept working in a lesser way eventually. I kind of, when I left the family, which I had to do, I really knew I couldn't kind of be myself and father my children the way I wanted to, staying in. But that kind of brought with it a responsibility not to make the same mistakes all over again in the next cycle of my life. So I started thinking, okay, well, it's quite possible, isn't it, that this might be about more than just everyone else. It might actually be about me. And the thing that really fascinated me, that really, really fascinated me, was I'd known for years that I was overworking, and I'd known that I was unhappy, and I couldn't do a single thing about it. It didn't matter how tired I was. It didn't matter that I felt ill at weekends sometimes. It didn't matter that it was ruining relationships and kind of drying out my heart. I actually couldn't do anything about it, and this absolutely fascinated me. It's like, duh, you should be doing this, and then, yeah, but you can't. Why don't those two things come together and a sensible outcome come? And it was only really when I collapsed on a train one evening going up for a meeting, which resulted in me taking a week off. That was in November 2014, and I kind of lay in bed and I thought, if I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? And I've always kept myself fit and healthy, and I kind of been trading off the capital that had given me. And I also kind of was starting to think, do you know what? One day, it's not too distant future, it's going to catch up on you. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to wait until literally, you've had a stroke or something, or are you actually going to do what a part of you has been telling you all along you need to do? And at that moment, really, because as I say, I'd collapsed on a train, I kind of passed out. No one really knew what was up with me, and it was the first time that it had got in the way of work. I'd always trimmed out the other things in my life, the social commitments, so that my work performance was great. And this was the first time I had a week of meetings lined up. I couldn't do it, and ironically, it was probably, if I'm honest, that made me think, oh wow, you really got to do something about it now, because it's getting in the way of
Back to
your
work.
It's crazy, but there's a thing in coaching, right? When you see people who have certain patterns, even there are two ways of doing, there are lots of ways of doing things, but one is to try and reshape the pattern if they want to, but another is to kind of use the pattern and turn it to the benefit of the client, right? So that was a good example. I had a pattern of work is top. Okay, well, if work is top, you've got to sort yourself out, haven't you? And that started me on a journey of therapy, coaching. Really, I hadn't heard the word systemic, or systems or all of that. It got me into that. It got me. I'm back. I've been back at the bar. I never stopped, but I know that I was struggling. I wasn't as my energy wasn't really connected to my work in the way it had been, and it's got me reconnected. I'm absolutely loving my work, and it's sorted out my main personal issues, if you like. It enabled me to enter into a relationship and not screw it up, uh, not it's not entirely one's own fault, but one has to take responsibility for one's own part, right? It got me back fathering my children despite a very conflict-driven divorce, all of those things. And then I thought, wow, if it's worked for me, and I've literally been down the bottom of the well and struggling, then it can work for other people. So I then trained in the stuff that I received. I trained as a systemic coach. I trained in constellation therapy, which I know Zita, who was on the podcast earlier, has done. I now teach that in the main school. I've just started teaching in July, the School of Systemic Constellations. And I just thought, well, if it helps me, it can help others. So then I started adapting what I'd learned to do training for law firms, training for the bar, and then also adapted it for one-on-one coaching. And really, really became fascinated as a result of what I'd gone through about this thing that I kind of started talking to you about at the very beginning, which is the fact that we take our own personal patterns to work with us, and unless someone has the insights and introspection, we don't really realize we're doing it, and we don't really realize when it's showing up. And often people's challenges are not because they're not clever enough or they're not good enough or whatever. It's because the way they've learnt to see the world in one context is being carried into another context, the work context, where it's not needed, and oftentimes it's not helpful. And there are ways of dealing with that, and then there are skills that can come in to fill the gap and everything. And I really enjoy that. And another reason I really enjoy it is not only does it empower people in the workplace, it brings back lots of love to the family. Because when people resolve their family things, even if their parents have died or whatever, suddenly their spirit comes alive, because they can see their parents in a loving way, or their challenges as a gift, and all of these things. So you get a kind of a two for the price of one, right? You can go back into working well, and because you've resolved your personal things, and that's a real privilege, actually. It's a lovely thing to have. So I do some law firms send people, but also consultancy firms that I've met through my law work will also send people. So they're not lawyers, but they're other people, managers and higher tier professionals. And it's a wonderful privilege to be able to, when people come and they're willing to kind of open the door or the window of their heart and their soul and share it with you, and to take a journey that helps them put in place and reorder things that have been troubling them, and then to see them thrive again at work. It's lovely. I love my bar work. When I do a cross examination and it's gone really well, I get a real buzz, and I get exactly the same buzz when people benefit from and do get good results from the coaching work and from the systemic constellation work I do as well. It's a long answer to your question.
It's a great answer to the question, and it brings up in me the reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast. You mentioned Zita, your wife, who was on a few months ago talking about systemic work and systemic constellation. So I'll point our listeners back to that episode with Zita, and I may ask you just for a brief overview of systemic stuff in a moment, just for those that haven't worked the whole back catalogue of intelligent teams. But I'm going to put a pin in that for a moment, because we met at the same time in the sauna in northwest London, where all of a sudden we were talking about coaching. I was like, what on earth is going on? And then Zita was like, oh, my partner, my husband also does this kind of work in law firms. The way I think of the bar and lawyers and the law is, it's dispassionate. It's the law is sort of objective out there, and people who work in it, this may be a complete misinterpretation or misunderstanding, but the idea is that it's this objective thing that sits between us, that mediates how we live, and people who work in it are sort of, it's very technical, and it's very either you sort of get lost in it or something like that, and your humanity as the lawyer may play well in a film or something, but most of the work is people grinding out enormously long hours under a lot of pressure, under a lot of the lawyers that I speak to, I don't ever envy their lives.
Yes.
I never think that sounds great. I wish I could do that. It sounds sort of torturous a lot of the time, and you sort of describe that in your own biography. And so going from something that is, or taking a very human-centered, systemic, I don't know, person-centered, heart-opening,
Yeah.
soulful way of being into that kind of work, and then seeing the mutual interdependence and interplay and mutual benefit of that just sounds like a fascinating place to be. So I don't know if there's a question in there.
Well, there's an observation I might make, which is the difference between the law and lawyering. So the law is generally those things, a kind of objective set of rules that apply rules to facts. I mean, in criminal law, of course, motives and things are relevant, but in most law, it's just, the stuff that happens and does it fall one side of the line or not, even though it's people's lives or their livelihoods or their life's work or whatever it might be. But lawyering, it seems to me, is the most kind of passionate of human endeavors. And why? Because it really is about communication and relationships. I mean, obviously it is at the same level that any kind of team working is, right? So I do lead teams and with experts and consultants and lawyers and the clients, and then that's kind of, and at any one time I'll be leading many different teams on different cases. And then when you get up in court, that's another relationship system that's created there. You, the judge, the other side here, the witness, the court clerk, your junior, the clients behind you. There's a whole relationship system going on, overlaying with different levels, and each having different expectations and demands. And then as an advocate, certainly for me, I'm always kind of strategizing. If I say this to this person and it's being heard by that person, what's the effect going to be over there, and how does that, and all the rest of this. So that's quite a complex set of teams. But more fundamentally, lawyering presses on the personal dynamics that are deeply embedded on us, like conflict, an obvious one, right? All of us have different tolerances for patterns around ideas about conflict. Entitlement, asking for something, right? We all have that. That's like a key dynamic in the family. How were you received when you needed something? How were your needs met? Well, that arises in teams. If I need to negotiate a deadline with someone, do I think they're gonna be well receptive or not? Do I dare ask? But then when I'm negotiating, if I'm a lawyer and a solicitor and I'm negotiating across a table, what are my expectations? What's my worldview about whether when I ask for something I'm likely to get it or not? That's a very personal thing, but then it's a professional thing. When I cross-examine a witness, how comfortable am I when they push back? What if the judge raises their voice? What if the judge is about the same age as my father and they raise my voice? So those are just a couple of examples. Also, I suppose, particularly for lawyers who have this thing of perfectionism, what's my view of my own self-worth, and to what extent do I need affirmation from other people? Again, a very, very core family-based pattern dynamic, but it comes up all the time in law, and in other service industries, I guess, because you're providing a service that's being asked for by somebody. Do they like what you've done or not? If I have to give negative advice and the client's not going to like it, am I willing to take the risk of not being liked by the client? If I've got a submission to make to the judge who may disagree with it and argue with me, am I brave enough to engage in that argument, or do I think actually if he disagrees with me, that somehow is about me and it impacts on me and it makes me feel small or bullied or something like that? So these personal dynamics are absolutely running rife in lawyering. So I would say lawyering is a very kind of passionate endeavour, even if the law is objective and relatively cold and careless about those things.
Yeah, I think as I was trying to make that reflection before, I was thinking, actually, you do throw yourself into a case, or there are plenty of people that take up the lawyering or become lawyers because they care about a cause
Yeah.
and there's nothing more human than that, to throw your endeavors into like a cause that you think is just, or
Yes.
to help or defend the defenseless, things like that. how does your showing up for lawyering differ now, having done this work and explored some of this stuff, than how it would have in 2013 before exploring some of
Yeah.
these things? Those
Ooh.
interactions with the judges and the
Yeah. It's Well, my teamwork is completely different. I mean, I didn't know. No one. It's remarkable, right? No one at the bar, for example, is taught teamworking skills. They just the bar has this rather quaint system of education, which basically involves the juniors or pupils, as they're called, before they get a place in a chambers, following around a senior barrister, their pupil supervisor, and basically just copying, learning by copying. Whether whether they do it well or badly or indifferently, it's just like that's what you see. So you don't know any better, so you keep doing it, and then you learn over time what works and what doesn't. So no one had ever taught me how to operate a team, how to run a team. So I used to be asked things, and we're all at the bar asked it, and other lawyers are. Here's the case background. Here are the facts. Here are the questions we want some advice on. And I'd go in thinking, okay, I've got to know the answer. They're asking me for the answer because I'm who I am. I've got to know the answer. And very often my conversations with the team around the table would really just for me be a kind of perfunctory set of steps in order to pass enough time so that I could then tell them what the answer was that I'd worked out before I came through the door, right? Um, Now I do it completely differently. Now I do a similar thing to what we do when we're constellating. Actually, I tend to hold lightly my idea of the answer, and then collaborate with everyone and see what the answer actually is, which may be my idea of the answer, but it might not be, or it might turn out to be a variant of that, or whatever. And of course, there are some things that the client asks which are black and white. Is the law on this that, or is it that? But most things, particularly in the complicated cases, they're judgment calls, they're strategic things, and so one needs not only to bring everyone on board, but just simply to make what's likely to be a better quality decision in the outcome, to talk to people. So I think I probably didn't do that, or at least I didn't do it effectively. I didn't really listen. I didn't open up conversations with people to explore. Always used to think about one of the really interesting things I've learned through coaching is the difference between listening to help me understand and listening to help the person speaking understand. And it would always be about me, me, me. You've asked me, I'm sitting at the head of the table, right? I'm asking you questions so you can tell me so I can understand. Now it's very much like, so when you say that, what do you really mean? And then what does that mean to you? And then how does that wash over the case? And particularly with clients, right? Because clients, it's the same if you're coaching a team or a person. They come thinking they want one thing, but when you explore it, actually there might be something better that they're missing that they really want. And so I do a lot of that, and I tend to use kind of coaching conversations in my meetings. I run then, because now I'm in Silk, I get to work with juniors a lot. So I always have meetings about, doing a big case at the moment. And I was worried about it. I knew my junior would be worried about it. So we had, what are you looking forward to in the case? What are you really frightened about? What about this case frightens you? I'll tell you what frightens me about it. And it was like, it's like such a relief. And then how can what do you need to help you with that? And I'll tell you what I need to help me with that. What do we think? What are the skeletons in the cupboard that we're worried about, and how can we deal with them now? All of these kind of, you might call them now sort of braver conversations, I suppose. But I don't approach things now with the misconception that I ought to know the answer, or that if I ask for things, even simple things, it's because I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy. It's actually because I need to know, and I can help you better if I know. So that's certainly something. I think there are two other things which are really significant for me. Another thing is presence. My whole cross-examination and court presence and advocacy is completely different, because one gains from not only resolving one's own patterns, and so quietening yourself down and learning to self-regulate yourself well, and learning how to anticipate what might put pressure on myself, but also the process of working with teams and groups, facilitating and holding space with a one-on-one client. one's capacity to deal with stuff, unexpected stuff, just grows immeasurably. And in fact, one starts to enjoy the anticipation of something that you don't know coming up. Because you think, oh, what can I do with that? What does that mean? So my presence is completely different and much, much stronger. And then the third thing is boundaries. I've learned, particularly through the systemic work and not just the systemic constellations. I did a program called ORSC, Organisation Relationship Systems Coaching, I think it's called, and learning there about teams and roles and the various kind of layers and dynamics around roles and resourcing and things like that. So my boundaries now are firm, which helps me not overwork, but it also means I'm better at delegating. I'm better at seeing in the team who might need support, anticipating what things might go wrong, knowing the right distance to keep from the client or from the issue so that I can maintain my objectivity and not get kind of pulled into the dynamics. Those kinds of things are really significant for me because they make us, if we can stand in the right place in relation to the case and in relation to the client and the rest of the team or the other side's team, you're strong right then, you're on a solid foundation. Whereas if one's own dynamics and motives for getting into the kind of helping relationship in the first place are kind of hooking you in, it can be really difficult to then have the integrity and objectivity to do one's job, which is what you're being paid for, right? Not to agree, but to stand back and say what is,
I was wondering if you had any stories from this time or noticing where you maybe were in a group with your team, or when you were in a moment of presence, or when you were holding a boundary, where you sort of realised this for yourself, like, oh wow, like I wouldn't have done that a few years ago.
Yeah, there are a couple. I'll give you one and see if it answers your question in a way that makes the point. I was cross-examining somebody. I do something called compulsory purchase, which is where the government or public authority take away land they have to show an overriding public interest, like for HS2, right? They can purchase land, and they have to pay compensation. But there's a process, a kind of hearing that has to happen to justify the compulsory purchase, and very often these are hard cases because people's they've built up a business or made a home, and it's being taken away. And I was doing a case a few years back, and there was a shop which a family who had come over from South Asia had bought in the late 50s. And they worked really hard, and then they'd bought the flat on top, and then they'd let that, and then with the money they'd bought the property next door, and they'd done that. And they had this beautiful business going, and they had a lovely family, and they wanted to pass it on to their gift for their children. But it also had this huge emotional significance that this was the place literally they'd put their feet when they came here. And my parents both immigrants, right? So I knew that this was going to be challenging for me to cross-examine on. I was at risk of kind of slightly being pulled in, and so I can remember very clearly defining my boundaries. One thing I often do is if I think there might be a kind of parental overwash, if you like, as I just imagine my parents behind me, because I know if they're behind me, they can't be that person who I'm standing in front of. That's a very simple thing. And then anyway, so the lady came to give evidence, and I needed to get out of her information about what she thought about the kind of the merits of the case, not just complaints about how badly she was being treated. And she was kind of, just couldn't speak because she was so upset. And so the very beginning, very early on in the cross-examination, I said to her, I've read your evidence and I can see that, this property must mean a huge amount to you because you've staked your life on it and you've built your family's future on it, and it must be hugely, hugely demoralizing and upsetting for you to think that now it may be taken away. And getting emotional saying it. And she looked at me and she said, yes. And I could see the tears in her eyes. And I said, well, I think we should all just take a moment and just acknowledge that. And I just sat there quietly for probably only about a minute, but it seemed like a very long minute. And it just allowed that release to happen, and it allowed her to know that she was being seen and that someone was listening. And then I said to her, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And she went, "Yes." And I said, "If it's all right with you, do you mind if we continue?" And she said, "Yes." And then I was able to ask the questions. I would never have dreamed of doing that. Not only would I not have thought it, if I thought it, I'd have thought, oh my God, but how am I going to sit there quietly? What's going to happen if she starts crying? How am I going to cope with that emotional thing, you know? And that's, I mean, that's just one example. It's kind of an example of a whole world of opportunities or options or ideas that open up. Yeah.
It's a really nice story, and it pulls on the reality that often our work isn't like comfortable and requires us to navigate conflicts of. It seemed like there was an element there, like playing out of your own story in this person, where you were going to be involved in helping the government to come in and take away someone's thing, and that may have been the role or the right thing to do, but that's not always easy. And often in work, we're called in to make a difficult decision about whether someone passes probation or not, or whether we get to carry on with someone's project, or whether we promote someone, or things like that. And often the answer is no.
Yeah.
For good reason. So the more we can be aware of how we're bringing ourselves to that and what we're bringing to that moment, that can make it be a humane experience, even if it's not what the person opposite us wants.
That's really interesting observation, right? Because we have in certainly the systemic work that I do, very strong ideas about, well, not strong ideas. We acknowledge fate and the dignity of people's fate. And that might sound, a bit kind of woo-woo-ish for a lawyer, but it has a very concrete application, because, as I was saying at the very beginning, a lot of lawyers regard themselves, at some level as being the reason why the case is won. I won that case. I won that case. I have won this. I succeeded. They post on LinkedIn. I won this. And of course, we're a cog of many in a machine. You've got the witnesses, you've got all the groundwork that's been done, you've got the laws, the policies, the judge. I mean, the judge is actually the one who decides the case, not the lawyer. To remind ourselves of that. And of course, if one runs one's law practice with an anchor in the idea that the fate of the case rests on one's own shoulders, then you're always setting yourself up for trouble, right? Because fundamentally it doesn't. And then we feel big about and grand about ourselves when we win, and then we don't acknowledge everything else and everyone else. And then, like I said, we feel awful when we lose, or we blame it on somebody else, so we lack that kind of introspection of what part we might have played. Whereas, if one acknowledges that one has a part to play, but really the fate of the case rests beyond our power, one can still engage in the question of how can I do my part well, while still being indifferent isn't the right word, but not pulled in to the not so invested in the outcome,
or getting a particular outcome.
Yeah, of course, one wants one's own client to do well, but the difference between wanting it and having an emotional or an energetic hook in the outcome. And so fate has something to say about that boundary, and then also dignity does, because one has to acknowledge that one has to be able to give the client the dignity to suffer the consequences of their own life. One has to be able to give the judge the dignity to perform their role. One has to give oneself the dignity to say, I can argue and draft documents and advise, but a point comes where I'm handing stuff over to something else and it gets mixed in with other stuff, and then the judge takes it or the client takes it if you're advising it, or whatever. And that's also about the dignity of respecting my position.
So not thinking that you can do it all and it's all on you,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
other people in this system work.
Because we diminish other people if we make ourselves too big, because we're taking something away from them.
Hmm. Can you share a bit about the systemic coaching modality and what it looks like and what it's about?
Yeah, big question. I'm just pondering what level to try and enter that in.
There's a nice YouTube channel, I think, of getting experts to explain to like 5 different ages of people their topic. So you end up with Jacob Collier, the musician, like explaining to a 5-year-old what a chord is, and it's like, isn't it nice where you do this? And then to a secondary school student, and then to a sixth former, and then to a university, and then to like explaining to Herbie Hancock harmonics and things like that, and it's sort of getting more and more complex. Why don't we start with the like if you were explaining uh, to a 6-year-old systemic constellation, what would that look like?
Then it would be okay. So you know what it's like when you meet someone and you have a reaction to them, and if it's something good, you have like a joyful reaction, and you can feel your heart open up and the smile come on your face and everything else. And if it's something that frightens you, you can feel your stomach churn and you want to escape and your chest goes tight and all of that. Well, oftentimes, those, well, always I would say, those reactions are telling us something. They're telling us something about ourselves, and they're telling us about what we're thinking or anticipating about the other person. And very often we won't know enough about the other person to know whether what we're thinking or anticipating is true or not. But something in us is predicting or being reminded of some other experience, and so we're kind of racing ahead of the game already. And so what we do with systemic constellations is we use that body information and other information, what you think and what you see and so on, in order to try and understand what those reactions are about, and to hold on to the helpful things in them and to loosen the unhelpful things in them, so that next time you meet someone who previously might have given you that reaction, you can actually see them for who they really are rather than imagine them to be somebody else.
Hmm.
That would be might be a little bit intelligent 6-year-old.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I knew the word anticipation expert, but I think that does it. So when that doesn't happen, the way I understand that is I'm in a team at work and somewhere scenario in my life, whatever, and I encounter somebody and I unconsciously make guesses about how they're going to behave and who they are, and then that
Yeah.
impacts my behavior. So if I
Yeah.
manager who I see as a sort of I accidentally see them as a sort of parental figure, I will
Yeah.
treat them like they are a parental figure, for better or for worse, and that doesn't give the opportunity to hear what they're actually saying, or to listen to what they're actually offering, or to give them what they need, or to ask them for what I need, or whatever,
Yeah, or to bring our best, right?
or to
Or
say,
to or to bring our best,
mm.
you know, whatever that might be. The request we need to make, or the contribution that the team or the business would benefit from.
So what are some of the tools you would use, or the methods in systemic
Yeah.
constellation?
So I mean, a typical. I tend to I try as far as possible to kind of not be formulaic or anything. In other words, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out with the client what's going to work. What's the best way of dealing with this, because all clients are different and people react differently to different kinds of suggestions or interventions, and people are ready for different kinds of things. Um, I tend to be very collaborative and exploratory, but I'll give you an example of a typical framework. So let's take the example that you've given, right? So someone comes and they've been sent because their employment review said that don't seem to be communicating well with their boss. They're not speaking up or something like that. So I guess the first I mean, always normally kind of, the first step is to kind of figure out what's the reality that we're starting from. So, what are you thinking, feeling, where are you feeling it, when? I mean, and it might be in the example you've given, when you even imagine talking to them, not just when you actually talk to them. When you receive an email saying, can we have a meeting next week? What starts to happen, and that will, and we can do that through conversation, but we can also do that through using representation. So putting a marker on the floor for your boss, Fred. Okay, imagine that's Fred. Stand. Where's a comfortable place to stand in relationship to them? What happens if you move closer? What happens if you move further away? Are you more comfortable if they're looking slightly to the side? All of these things, because they tell you what's hidden in the relationship space. And then by articulating the feelings, we get a sense of what's going on. And people will say, I feel anxious, nervous, whatever it might be. And then one can explore things like, if you have a request to make, what's your level of confidence that it's going to be met, for example? They'll tell you something about what their view is of how generous the world is likely to be to them, for example. So we can explore these things, and then the next step would be to figure out what the reasons are for being that way. And it might be because Fred's notorious for being a complete jerk, and in which case, that might be the reason. And it's something we always have to remind ourselves of, actually, that sometimes the answer isn't something that needs to be worked on personally. Sometimes one is working in a toxic team, or with a toxic boss, or whatever it might be, and we have to acknowledge that, right? Rather than imagine there are kind of superpowers that can be learned to deal with everyone. But assuming that's not the case, we would normally, with the permission of the client, explore how the clients, they've learned about making requests, or asking for their needs to be met, or dealing with potential conflict. And that will normally, I will normally ask, in the home growing up, so we'll explore what the relationship was with the father, with the mother, whether the family stayed together, what were the stresses or traumas in the family biography. It might be, I'll just make up one. Just imagine a child growing up in a household where the father lost their job, so the family didn't have much money. And then the child might say, I wanted lots of things growing up, but I could never ask. And when I asked my dad, he got really angry and he would shout at me, and because he'd lost his job. And Mum would always tell me, there, don't ask your dad, but come and speak to me and I'll try and sort you out, right? Just take that as a little sketch. You can see quite easily that somebody like that might, and it's always a might, because everyone's different, and it's never a coach's role to kind of say, hi, in the light of what you've told me, this is the answer. Never like that. But one could see, exploring that the client might draw a link between, I get nervous asking my male boss because actually when I was growing up, it was really frightening to ask my dad things. And I didn't feel I would ever get given what I asked for because we didn't have the money. And then you might say to them, okay, go back to that time. How does it feel in your body? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you imagining? And then you might do, it would be a simple exercise, marker on the floor for boss, and then a few meters away, marker on the floor for dad. Stand opposite dad. Imagine you're asking, what are you feeling? Okay, brush that off. Stand opposite boss. Imagine, how do these two feelings that you're getting relate? And it might be, they're completely different. Actually, they're completely different, which is great. Then that's not maybe it's not lying in that territory. But they might say, wow, I never realised I feel exactly the same. And then you can kind of, and obviously it's got to be something that lands with the client, otherwise it doesn't work. But often clients will then think, gosh, I can really see now how that there I'm carrying into here. Now, then we have a kind of baby and bathwater thing, right? We want to see what's the good in that. So again, using that example, well, the good might be, I've learned to be discerning when I ask and when I don't. I've learned strategies to get round potential blocks. I'm better with women than I am with men. You know, I've learned how to grow up in a family of scarcity and hardship. I've got resilience. I've learned how to do with that. I mean, there might be all sorts of nuggets in that on the surface traumatic story, which we can bank. And I'm a person who has got through this, and I've learned this, that, and the other, and I've got these qualities. And then there's a piece of work around loosening that pattern, which is really about closing the open loop of child that's still open from childhood, which might be a feeling, I didn't get enough from my dad, or my dad didn't love me, or and that will be a piece of work. I suppose one might call it around reframing, if you like, but there are different ways of doing it. But the essence of it is to get the client to help the client find the message of love that was really behind what, as a child, they felt as being a hardship. For example, your father knew that to care for your mother and your siblings and you, he needed to control the purse strings. Much as he would have wished to have given you everything he wanted, he knew that for you all to survive and grow up and be well and safe, he needed to control the purse strings. And in fact, from his anger you can measure his love, because there you have an expression of the deep frustration he must have felt at not being able to give all the things he would have wished to have given you, for example. And there are different ways of walking with the client through that kind of story, but the reason I'm just verbalizing it like that so that you can see it, the reason I wanted to verbalize it like that is I've learned that it's important. A lot of people talk about, I don't want to talk to my dad anymore, or my parents were mean to me growing up, whatever. We're stronger when we acknowledge and accept, and we're stronger when we're closer to people in our family, or at the right distance from them. Sometimes, if it's been a really abusive relationship, closer isn't stronger, closer is weaker. But we need to find a flow of love, ideally, even through that can kind of throw a light on the hardship. Because once people realise they were loved, deals with a whole lot of questions and problems, right? I mean, a lot of inadequacies and imposter syndromes and things like that come from an idea that we were never quite enough. Once we can feel that we were enough, and also that, as an adult, we have the capacity to look back at things that happened to us as children, and with the wisdom of our adultness, reassure our child self that actually, although we didn't realise it at the time, and yes, it was painful at the time, now we can see it was done out of love. And that's really, I guess, that's the purest kind of healing that one can hope for, I think. Now, you imagine doing that with a barrister, or it's like, what? But another wonderful thing is, of course, people are self-selecting, right? People come because they know they need something, and they feel that the door they're walking through might be the route to it. And often they've tried other things. So when I initially started out, I thought, how can I possibly do any of this beautiful work with these, hard-nosed, dispassionate lawyers? But actually, the right people come, and it's been more of an edge for me to navigate, having the bravery to step into that space, than actually for the client to navigate. The client's already arrived; they've already done that bit. Am I gonna show up for them and meet them? Has been one of my things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic that I experience quite a lot of. I have a team, not barristers, but software engineers or people who are hot shit at what they do, technical people. And I want to bring soulful human practices and experiences there, but I hold myself back a lot of the time because I go, well, they're not going to take me seriously, or they're not going to, this isn't going to work for them. And it becomes a self-fulfilling belief of, well, if I never show it to them, then if I never try things that touch on their humanity, or that maybe don't explore in the same kind of depth as what you're talking about, but nonetheless with their own story or their own experiences or their own passions or their own deep stuff, spiritual stuff even, I don't know. Well, then there's never an opportunity to do it and it becomes a self-fulfilling belief.
Yeah.
Whereas that's work for me to do. That's not work for them to do.
Yeah, it's funny, this idea of deep. We intuitively. I was having a conversation on LinkedIn with someone the other day, a few weeks ago, and it was about keeping one's heart open in conflict, and the idea that actually we're stronger if we keep our heart open in conflict than if we close it off. Something you said there about holding back from the deep conversations is kind of resonating with that, because we have this idea that that the deep or the personal means vulnerable, which it does, but that it kind of only means vulnerable, whereas of course it also means strong and strengthening and enriching and growing and connecting and all of those other things that come with it. And I think it's easy to forget that in a sense those other things are what many or most people are striving for. They're also the things which in teams give the performance and the connection and the trust and the collaboration and the creativity and everything, right? Too. So I'm reading a great book, The Metaphors We Live By. I can't remember now who it's by. It's quite a well-known book. And
Lakoff and Johnson.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Actually, is over here. Yes. Sorry, that's
it. And I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of NLP training, and there's quite a lot of that kind of linguist stuff in it. But again, once one raises one's awareness about these kind of metaphors that are so close to us that we don't see them, and then they're so normal that they actually become the truth rather than just the metaphor. Same with this idea of what does deep mean? Well, it's like we're going down somewhere dark and murky, and we may never come back, and all of those things. But there's lots of baggage and presuppositions that kind of go along with certain words. I think that we need to be, maybe it's time to kind of clear out a bit. I don't know.
Find the conclusion of what deep could mean, because deep also could mean like safe and rooted and grounded, and there's maybe an element of that as well as I don't know, in a way that resonates for me more as like deep work is where the safe stuff is, rather than it being the raw exposed things, or I don't know, maybe both.
But I wonder, when we hesitate about going deep with a client, is it because of our own vulnerability? Is it out of a respect for their vulnerability? I mean, obviously there are, consent issues and permission, but put that to one side. Or what? And maybe, I mean, as you're talking, actually, I can see there's actually a conversation to be had with a client around what doing deep work means.
Yeah, that's definitely a new thing for me to think about, which is you could touch into core deep unexplored, or I don't know, I'm sure there's a bunch of different associated words we can come up with, but coming at it as a position of, and these are strong things for you, rather than I'm going to open up something raw and difficult. And I think that's maybe where my worry comes from doing the deep work with a client or with a team, is we're going to touch something really painful and in public and exposing, and it might be harmful, and I may not be able to hold it, and all of those things might be true. But if we start with, actually, let's think of the depth that contains passion, that contains motivation and drive and stability and all those things, and see that as the kind of deep work, then it feels less scary for me to try and ask someone about, like, what do you care most about this job?
Yeah, it's an easier access point. I mean, that's another thing that I think is really interesting about organizational team coaching, is how one manages to pitch the depth of the work when one's working with a group, because of the vulnerabilities. Oftentimes the situations when one's called in is because there are, trust issues or relationship issues or performance issues, which will be symptoms of a lack of safety, as it might be called. And so navigating that, I think, in a team is interesting. And I'm often. So I guess here's another thing. You asked me about how the coaching and the law and my lawyering has interacted. Well, here's another example. That awareness of where do I go? What really is going to be the effect of doing this or doing this or doing this or doing this in this moment, and what am I feeling about the group that I'm in that can inform what the best intervention is to make, the best question to ask, or the best conversation to open up. Because I think particularly from group coaching and from facilitating groups, one starts to develop a more nuanced and sensitivity towards how to pitch what one might do in the light of all the differences that are coming together that then make the group, And I didn't really have that awareness at all before. If I was working with a team, I would have my script of what I was going to do, and I would just do it. If so-and-so at the end of the table didn't seem to be liking it very much, well, what's their problem?
Can you say a bit more about how that works or what that feels like when it's happening?
I think for me, I've developed a lot more sensitivity around picking up signs of what's going on. Using myself, which is very much an organisational team coaching tool, as reflecting back what's happened. So sometimes I might give some advice in a team, and I know it's not very popular. It's not because it's the wrong advice, the right advice, but it's not the advice people want to hear. And I can see it written and I might turn to the client, and say, "Well, Fred, I had this happen the other day. Client's not called Fred, but I'll call him Fred. Fred, literally, I can see your dismay written on your face, and I imagine there are a few words going through your head now, and probably a few of them have 4 letters on." And he said, yeah. And then we have a conversation about it. So it's not just, well, that's my advice, go away and think about it. We have a conversation about it, well, what does that feel like, and what does it mean to you, and how's that going to affect what you do, and what's your reflection on it? Do you think there's a different way that we might manage the risks that I've highlighted? Is there a different way managing that would work better for you? But you can't open that up unless you see it and you're willing to hold the space to have the difficult conversation. And I would never have been brave enough to do that before I started doing my coaching. Never. I guess the other thing is I've become far more client-centered. That's one of the beautiful things about the coaching and the therapy work, is just setting yourself up and understanding what or who you're in service of and why. That has really helped with the law. I think a lot of lawyers, it's too much about them. It's too much about them and not enough about being in service for the client, and what does that really mean.
The phrase that comes up when you were talking about that is participatory sense making. I don't know if you've come across this. I'm not even sure if I've come across it, but it's the idea of, as you're going along and as you're participating in the process, and I think I'm probably butchering it a bit, but making sense of what's going on, and then from that position of sense making, choosing the next participation, and those being interplaying. So your job as a lawyer for your client is to help them get where they need to go in this domain, and their response to what you suggest tells you something important about that. So if you're able to name it, which takes some bravery and some self-awareness, and takes some ability to say, hey, they're having a bad reaction, that's not because I'm bad, but it's because it's telling us something about them and what they need, or it's maybe this crosses a boundary for them, and let's find out about that, and then maybe I can tailor something to their solution a bit more. If I'm working with a team and I can suggest a thing and it goes down badly and it produces a lot of noise or a lot of discussion, it tells me that, hang on, this isn't landing so well with these people. Maybe I've misunderstood what pressure they're under, or what they need, or how they operate. And then my advice or my suggestion or my offering or whatever, my experiment that I want to run, whatever, it doesn't matter. Or if I'm working with a team who's under incredible pressure internally and externally, and they've got loads of deadlines to hit and they've detailed work and whatever, then my experiment and my hey, let's move fast and break things sort of approach violates something important for them, which is like we can't really
Yeah.
make mistakes. There's consequences to that. So we need to find a safer way of
Yeah,
doing
which
things.
is leadership, right? I mean, that's that's leadership. And as you've been speaking, I've been thinking, well, that's another thing that's changed. Partly it's changed just because of seniority, but more fundamentally, I don't see myself as being just a barrister who has to do the barrister's role. I see myself as being someone who is also very much responsible for leading the team, not as a resource for me, but as an entity in itself. That's very different. I think my experience of observing others is that a lot of people would see the teams they work with as a resource for them to help them do the job that they've got to do.
Yeah, it's I've been in jobs where the manager or the senior person's question is like, "How can you help me?"
Yeah,
And the good managers that I work with will always start from a position of like, "How can I
yeah,
help you with my experience, seniority, influence, whatever? Like, what do you need?" Sort of presencing the work is with the team
yeah,
doing the thing. It's not with the more highly paid person that talks about it
yeah.
or that leads it in some way. I was wondering if you could share a bit about how those teams, how those legal teams work, and what some of the, from the perspective of some of the mechanics or the issues, I can't quite work out how to phrase it, but what are some of the mechanics or the dynamics that come out in those kind of teams that are interesting to work with from a systemic team point of view? Does that question
Yeah,
make sense?
yeah, it does make sense. I suppose so. If I kind of try and analyze that in a kind of team coachy way, right? Then I guess the first thing is that le- like teams that are based around projects, they're formed for the project, and then they disband at the end. And those people will be on lots of other teams as well. So there's always a coming together and a moving apart, and a coming together and a moving apart. And so one has to be attentive to the kind of to the bonding to make sure that when people come together, they're as far as possible coming together with a common understanding of what the team culture and everything is each time, so that we've got our identity. I suppose that's probably the way of putting it. And to be fair, I've never done a specific piece of overtly of kind of culture making within any of my teams. I've kind of done it softly and through, kind of walking the talk and all the rest of that. But I've never done an overt piece of rule making or culture making or safe space creation or anything like that, which one might do in other contexts. And I don't know. That's probably an example of an edge that I haven't navigated, even though it's a fairly basic thing to do. It would be so unheard of. Interestingly, I've even written about it and suggested that other people do it. I've actually done it myself. I've done it with a law team. I've coached it to other teams and said, hey, look, what are the ground rules here? Okay, let's create a safe space. Here's a piece about psychological safety. This is why it's important. Da, 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 da. Let's work on how you want to be to do this project together. All the rest of that. Never done it in a legal team. Go figure. So I think that's important to have some cultural norms. Roles are super, super important because of the complexity of what's going on, and also, roles aren't simply in law work a kind of discretionary choice of who wants to do what. Because if you're litigating, for example, the court has a view on who is competent to do certain jobs. So roles and role definitions and handovers, when does your role end and yours begin, and who's responsible for that? That's super important. I think resourcing. I mean, I'm always now, from a coaching perspective, looking at the back of house of the teams that come towards me now. Okay, right, Frank, nice to meet you. Who else is working with you? How many people are there in your team? What are their work conditions? How much resource have they got? Because I want to know if something needs to be done. Who's actually doing it, and what's their capacity for it? I would never really have thought of asking this question before. You just say, okay, this is the deadline.
Make it happen.
That's it. Yeah, make it happen. I think the other thing that's really I've really found interesting is how the roles shift over time, including my own. You know, particularly on a piece of litigation, you might start at the very beginning of a journey where it's all about strategy and high level thought, and then you end where you're literally standing up in court, cross-examining someone and calling the witnesses from within your team after 3 years or 4 years, whatever it might be. And so one moment, but not moment, but some of the role is creative and expansive and everything like that at the early end, and then it gets very, very detailed and focused and objective driven and, you know, in the moment performance and all of that at the other end. And these roles and the pressures and what the team has to deliver shift over time. So your own way of leading has to shift over the time. And I think from my perspective, I'm aware that I tend to kind of try and get out of people's way in the early parts of the process so that we can get as much creativity and imagination and input from people. And then towards the coalface kind of trial end, it's more making sure everyone is getting exactly what they need in order to be ready on the day stuff, you know, confident that everything else has been done. So that changing over time, I think, is an important one.
It reminds me of a play or something where you've got what is this play about? How are we going to perform Hamlet? What is our artistic slant? Like, what are we trying to say amongst the thing? And then it moving down to like performance night, where it is about the timings and the lighting and the costume changes and the acoustics or whatever, and it is more sort of technical, but building on a shared vision that everyone has of like what it is. You know, this is a 1920s interpretation of.
And you've reminded me of something. So there's something else that I would never have thought of or done had I not done my coaching, which is ask the simple question: how do we want to be? When we show up in court, how do we want to be? It's not, you know, what words are you going to say and what order are you going to call the witness? How do we want to be? What energy do we want to create? What impression do we want to create? How are our voices going to be? How are we going to be slow and measured and calm? Are we going to pretend that we're outraged at the other side? And are different people going to do different things? And I would never have thought of that either. But this idea, you've now made me remember something that was kind of one of the big things when I started doing this, which is the idea of being conscious and purposeful. You know, so obvious to anyone who coaches or does, you know, teamwork or whatever, but not something that is really thought about for most lawyers. You know, they would think, I'm this kind of lawyer. You know, and we even get people phoning up chambers saying, you know, I've got a really hard negotiation to do. We need someone aggressive. You know, it's like as though there's a list of aggressive lawyers. Check.
I'll go to my aggressive lawyer Rolodex. Mad Max, Angry Angie, yeah.
Yeah. So actually, one of the things that I started out doing very early on when I was running workshops was really just dealing with this question of how can we be more agile and purposeful in our communication so that we can bring to bear what we need at the time. You know, you might be a naturally aggressive person, but you might want to be charming in that, or vice versa. So those questions as well in teamwork about being, how are we going to be at any particular time, I think important, and that's not something I would have ever dreamt about. I'd have taken the body of people and myself as a given. This is how we are. Now let's get on with it.
And there's a kind of interdependence between those things, right? Because if you do hire a bunch of the aggressive lawyers, or you do end up with a certain biasing towards certain people who do their role in a certain way, that will influence the culture and the way, and it will constrain how you can be. You know, if those aggressive people can't not be aggressive, then charming is off the table. But if you can create a space where we say, hey, naturally I'm aggressive, but I can charm and I need to here, and that's in service of the overall purpose here.
Yeah. Before we started recording, we were lent into a conversation which was along the lines of one understands more of what one does by being asked to explain what one does. And I'm now figuring out what I do and also remembering some of what I do, so thank you.
That's the idea. And that it's fun to listen to. Yeah. I want to dig a little bit into the the roles element of it, because that's a really interesting mechanic, which really interesting constraint in the law work. So I work in mostly with software teams where everyone has a skill and kind of a role, but it's a little bit fungible. It's a little bit able to be maneuvered. So you know what, if you need your software developer to get involved in a design session and to like be sketching stuff, that's allowed. But you probably have a designer who does that stuff for you. So there's like a natural orientation that falls out, but there are some sort of hard definitions. This person gets to have their access to the production server so that we don't break everything. But in general, the assumption is we want to try and spread skills and have multidisciplinary teams where each person has a few different things they can lean on, and not just have, deep specialists who can't turn their hand at something else.
Yeah.
But it sounds like in the teams you work in, there are statutory or procedural barriers as to like who can and can't do which things.
Not so much who can or can't do things kind of behind the scenes, within the privacy of the conference rooms and so on, but certainly when it comes to the front facing kind of court, appearing in court, you can only give evidence that's strictly within your expertise, even if you might have a great passion and knowledge about something else. You just can't do it because that's less exceptionally you might be able to, but generally speaking you can't. You have to be an expert in that field. And then also I guess there are other reasons like insurance and liability and things like that, right, if you step outside the bounds. So we do find though that, because same as I think what you're explaining, that people who have core roles do have expertise, knowledge, experience that kind of washes slightly into other things, and therefore they can add some creativity or a bit of resource to other people. And then there's that other thing in teams dynamics, the kind of the hidden roles, like who's the organizer, who's the person who keeps the humor going, who's the carer who makes sure that everyone's being looked after. All of those, very much, to use your expression, non-statutory roles. They're the kind of the inner emotional, energetic roles that people play in teams, which I find very interesting, because that also helps decide, who should be allocated to help who with what. Who should have the role of checking in with witness X to see how their expert report is going. Well, if it was me who does it, that's quite a kind of authoritative checking in. But if it's someone else in the team who's actually the one who always makes the tea and is organising the drinks after the Friday conference or whatever, that might actually be a friendlier and more effective form of checking in. So roles at that level I think are important.
So that's interesting. So there's on show day, just sort of hopping back a level, your expert witness can only be in their role. There's the formal roles that you might have at the presentation at the moment of appearing in court, and then the informal things that happen behind the scenes, which you want. If my tax consultant lawyer happens to have done a bit of time in this other area that we're also operating as part of this case, we want them to be able to share that because it's knowledge and it's perspective. But you don't. How do you handle? As in, is that part of the way that you set up the culture of we're all in this together and we all have enough perspective to be able to share that kind of thing? Or is this a problem that you often encounter where you go, I reckon you know that thing, but you didn't want to share it because you didn't want to tread on their toes, or you did share it and it did tread on their toes and it caused a blot?
Interesting. So I probably, the reason I'm a little bit, the reason it's very interesting, right? It's very interesting because you're now making me realise that although you're reflecting back an answer that I've given, this big light bulb just went off in my head saying, wow, there's probably a whole lot more resource in your teams than you realise. I'm saying that to myself, even though you're following a lead of something I said earlier. So it's like my own word, and it's part of what we're saying, kind of what happens when you have a conversation. So my
dialectic
answer. Yeah, my truthful answer to you is I don't know. And I don't know because I probably, as a leader, um, need to tr give more space for opportunity for people to give contributions outside their formal roles, right? And now I'm realizing actually that's probably a bit of kind of legal conditioning that that's the expert on that, that's the expert on that, he's the expert on that. So I unless people volunteer it, which they often do, and they're welcome to. I won't normally go searching for it. Very interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a thing that I think about with my teams, which is like, what's the group intelligence? Like, what do we know in the room or in the building that
Yeah. Yes.
are we allowing that to come to
Yeah.
fruition in the choices we make and in the way that we think about our decisions? Or is there someone sitting with what could be a good answer that they're not sharing because of
Yeah.
reasons, cultural reasons, role
Yeah.
reasons, rule reasons, whatever,
Yeah.
those kind of things. All right, we'll have
Yeah.
you
Well,
back.
thank
We'll
you.
have you back on for episode 2 once more preparation of that.
Resourcing outside of roles.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting because you mentioned that sometimes that like the resourcing or the who's actually working on this thing is not just the people in the room, right? You've got this
Yeah.
extended team of how many people are there in these conference rooms? Like 20?
A big one for me would be maybe 15, 16, something
Right.
like that, and then
And
there
then,
might be a few people on a screen as well.
and then if each of them has
Yeah.
a team of
Yeah.
between 2 and 30 analysts
Yeah.
or whatever's, then actually you've got this huge
Yeah.
society
Yeah.
formed around this thing being represented by certain voices, and like how is that playing in? The who I don't know. I'm wondering like who should have a seat at that table that isn't, or who should see what's happening there, or what are
Yeah.
we assuming about how information flows, or that kind of thing. Well, you need to get there's a balance between sort of pragmatism and what is the right size of people to have a conversation, and
Yeah.
also making most of. I find that so interesting because there'll just be norms that are like, well, when you get together with the barrister
Yeah.
from that chambers. I still don't really know all the words, but and they will bring with all their research with them, and that's just sort of a cultural inheritance, maybe.
Yeah. And then something what you've said is brought up is about my own role, right? So so there's a sense in which when I'm leading a team as a barrister, of course, I'm in the role of barrister, which in my example, I've imported lots of things from coaching and therapeutic roles, but I don't actually have permission to coach anyone. I certainly don't have permission to do any therapy with anyone. And so when you were talking about, what are we assuming about lines of communication and information flow, I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. But unless I see a problem as leader, do I actually have permission to make inquiries about that in a way I might have if I was coaching a team and the team came to me with a particular problem, right? So there's a kind of a role definition, dynamic conflict tension within me as well, which I hadn't really thought too much about.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Also, you don't want to tread on the toes as that that in that situation you have a kind of power as the
Yeah.
barrister that you there's different to the kind of power you have as
Yes.
a team coach, which
Yeah.
is if I turn to one of the other people and say like, sorry, where'd you get that information from, or like, can I meet some members of your team or something, some innocent
Yeah.
thing that might go down differently to as a coach
Yeah.
when you sort of ask, hey, let's
Yeah.
look at all the elements of the system that are contributing here.
Yeah. And if I was to use an expression like that, they go, "What are you talking about?"
But what are you trying to say? Like, what are you implying here?
Exactly. What page is that on?
Yeah. Is there something wrong? No, no, no. I don't know. Is there? Maybe. Let's be systemic about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there's an example of how, I'm often interested in how like norms constrain possibilities. So it's the norm of, like, I've worked in teams where it's totally normal for the leader to say, well, hang on, what else is going on here? Or let's get everything out on the table as much as possible so that we can give ourselves many options. And then there's places where that's that's less routine, but probably for good reason, because if every case was a blank canvas where you start again and like, let's rethink
Yeah.
this whole thing, you lose a lot of inherited wisdom of like, well, this kind of
Yeah.
works in lots of ways.
Yeah. I like your expression, how norms constrain possibility. The bar is a absolute a great, brilliant example of norms constraining possibilities, because there's this very conservative culture which is based on effectively mimicking what more senior people have done, who have learned through mimicking what other senior. I mean, I sometimes make a joke with people. There are people who are running their meetings as meetings used to be run in 1647, right? Because it's just like carried on, and there are all sorts of cultural norms at the bar, like, you know, you shouldn't turn work away, or you'll never establish yourself as a practitioner. Barristers should be able to get on top of things at the last minute. In order to succeed, you need to burn the midnight oil. There is no such thing as life-work balance. All of those things, which absolutely destroy possibility. I mean, the skills training one is a particular one. The bar is very inward when it comes to skills training. All the people who do training at the bar tend to be barristers, and the training until recently, and it's one of the things one of my missions to change, is all law technical training. You know, what does good advocacy look like? You know, how are the words to be said, and what structure? You know, all the rest of that. How do you lead a witness? You know, when you negotiate, in negotiation skills, it's all about the kind of tactics of getting to what you want to get to. But there is no training on you know, okay, well, if your advocacy is supposed to look like that, how do you deal with that when you get up in the morning and you feel awful? What if you're feeling anxious about your court appearance? What do you do then? What if you're frightened of cross-examining? What if you get nervous when you're against a senior opponent? Do you know how to build rapport with anyone? All of those things, all of those so-called soft skills, no one teaches at all. So it's all about the surface appearance of things. And it means that there are a lot of really, really super bright, talented people who are suffering because they aren't given the back of house skills that they need to perform the surface skills that they're drilled into them. They aren't taught that. And so all the workshops that I do for the bar are all about there's never a case mentioned, there's never any law thing or anything technical mentioned at all. It's all about internal dynamics and relationship skills, because that's the missing part.
And it's also that those people will pass on that suffering, right? Like,
yes.
You know, not because they want to, not because they want, that's normal. That's how I learned to be a barrister.
Exactly.
And probably also there are things about that suffering that do enable high performance, or do enable, you know, they'll probably be misbalanced at certain times. You know, if we just say, hey, let's start again from what would be the most humane way of doing it, like, we need to be open to the idea that the quality of the work might suffer, but probably it won't as much as we think, or not in the same ways, or I don't know.
Yes, I used to think that. And in fact, there was a time when a few years after I had my burnout, where I was getting back on my feet, and my insecurity wasn't there anymore. And I was suddenly faced with this thing: what's going to drive my work? And it's like, it's quite frightening, actually. Why should I care? If I feel all right myself, why should I care? Why should I care? But then, of course, you start thinking about things like, you know, client service, pride, self-respect. What are my professional standards going to be? How do I want to present to the outside world? What example do I want to set my children or juniors around me? All of those things. And there's a wonderful American coach, and I subscribe to his platform just because it's got lots of kind of very American, like, go for it things. His name's Brendan Bouchard, you know, multi New York Times award-winning, you know. And he does this thing every day called the Daily Fire. It's like a kind of 10-15 minute thing where he just speaks about a topic. And one of the things he said a while ago was, he said, I'm not going to try and do an accent. He said, yeah, it's true. You know, a lot of traumatized people and insecure people are driven to do magnificent things, absolutely fantastic things. And he said two things about that. One is, once they achieve those things, they still feel the same inside, right? It doesn't suddenly take away. And he says, and the other thing, he says, you know, trauma is like the pizza of motivation. It's like, you know, I get energy from eating pizza. I'll go on a run eating, you know, because I've eaten my pizza, and I like eating pizza, but you can't really sustain your life eating pizza. So he says, yeah, it's like the pizza of motivation. And it's true, you know, your insecurities can drive you, but they can't really sustain you, and they certainly can't sustain people in a happy, well balanced state. So I get exactly what you say about the performance, and it's true for as long as one doesn't put in place something to take the space when the trauma is resolved, put to the side a bit. So really, really wonderful thing about the bar now. So I find I used to find it almost heartbreaking when really bright people would come through the coaching door saying, I'm thinking of giving up because I can't cope. And they talked to you, they've got like double firsts from Oxford, and they're in these super commercial, and everything outwardly looks perfect. And it's a place I got to where I thought I've either got to quit or I've got to learn to do it differently, because I can't keep doing it in the same way. And it does still actually touch on my heartstrings when someone comes and they're like that, because I think it's not your problem actually. In a way, you haven't been served well by our profession because you haven't been trained and taught about the other things that you need. You've been taught some things that you need. But one of the lovely things about this generation is, and probably the people who are kind of up to 10 years cool or so, is they look at lots of senior people at the bar, and it's the classic thing. I think if that's success, no thank you, want it. And so they're asking for different answers. They really want it. Some of my clients are kind of only 3 maybe years into their profession, and they're already saying, I don't want to be like that. This is what I want to be like. Is it possible, and how can I do it? And that's just fantastic, because like you said, they all then get to pass that on to people, and then it really, really ripples down, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the bar culture changes over the next 10 years when how the rubber meets the road of like the human change meets. I was struck by the taking the silk thing. That like like you said, are sort of hundreds-year-old institutions where even the way that we think about what we call our job is about the kind of robe that you get to wear when you have the role, and these things are so embedded. And there will be ways that it will change, and it's exciting to see what that will be, and I'm curious to see how you play your role in that, because it sounds like you're at a kind of forefront of that change.
Well, I'm enjoying it, and I'm a member of. So there are different Inns of Courts, Middle Temple, Inner Temple, Gray's Inn, Lincolnton. I'm a member of Middle Temple, and they've been super supportive in letting me just get on and organise workshops, and they'll advertise them and stuff, and people come along. My chambers too. My chambers lets me hire a space there to run my family constellation workshops at weekends. And I don't think anyone in Chambers really understands what's happening, or the people in Middle Temple necessarily really do, but they kind of have a trust, and they're prepared to give me the space to do it. And for me, if one thinks of it systemically, that's kind of all one needs, right? One needs permission from the larger group to which one belongs, and it's really reassuring when that permission relates to something that's towards the kind of edge of the belonging, because then you're in the realm of change. And so I'm very grateful to others for either being overtly supportive or just saying sure,
not saying no when they could have.
And not saying no.
Well, what strikes me is like, it sounds like you had to earn a lot of seniority and experience and status before, in order to enable lots of those things to be possible. Like maybe a junior first year trainee saying, hey, can I borrow the thing? They might be like, no.
I gave a talk in Middle Temple in 2016 in front of about 350 people. Middle Temple have a program called Survive and Thrive, and I'd had a conversation with someone outside a cafe and told them a bit about what I was doing and everything, and eventually ended up doing this thing. And I started out within about 1 minute. I'd started opening a story, and after about a minute it ended with, well, it didn't end, but my jump off point at that moment was, and that person sitting opposite me was my therapist. And, like, the room just went, what the fuck did he just say?
Yeah, I think you said the quiet part out loud.
And I was thinking, and I committed to do this talk, and I nearly pulled out so many times, and then I did it, and an elderly gentleman came up to me afterwards, and he said, thank you. he said, thank you, he said, for talking. So I was talking about kind of well-being things, and I went through a catalogue of the norms, as you'd call them, and how they get in the way, and how I've basically, in my own attitude, challenged them, because I'm not willing to accept some of them. And he just said thank you. He said thank you for speaking out, because lots of us, like me, he was a retired High Court judge, have been suffering in silence the whole time. And I just thought, there's something to this. And then I realised, to go back to what you said, actually, I'm very successful at the bar. People in my sector know me. I'm ranked very highly, everything. So no one can point a finger at me and say, yeah, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, because you didn't make it and all the rest of that. And it actually keeps me in. I feel a kind of sense of responsibility to do my bar work really, really well, because I want people to see he's a guy who doesn't work weekends normally, doesn't work evenings normally, and does other things too. And he seems to be reasonably, try to be reasonably, kind to people and so on. And going, look, he's doing his job quite well.
And he's at the top of his game. He's not like, it's like, you would backstreet lawyering, easy to have all this woo-woo stuff. But no, this is part of what makes you,
Yeah. So, yes, but I do think, I agree with you. For junior people, had I been junior and not taken silk or not done as well as I had, it would be far more edgy, and I don't know how it would have worked out. I mean, I was forced into change anyway because of my personal circumstances, so maybe it would have been the same, but it certainly felt a lot more secure doing it from a higher place.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a trailblazing, right? Which is that maybe for you had to achieve a certain level of seniority, competence, whatever, like esteem before that was possible, and now that makes it a bit easier for the people following in your wake to be able to have those conversations and not have to have that level of success. So it's easier for the upstarts to not have to gain as much credibility.
Yeah, I mean, particularly the kind of baby barristers, because they can see, okay, I don't like that model of success, but something, I like the kind of things that you're doing and talking about, so tell me about that. And there is that, so this is the upside of us being self-employed, that in a way people can look to who they want to for their role models. There isn't we've got a great chairwoman of the bar at the moment, Barbara Mills Casey, who came out as soon as she was elected with that she started talking about well-being, and she set up a working party to look into coaching and support for the bar and stuff like that. And so these leadership figures do build bridges with the juniors and allow them a different model of future, which is good.
That feels, with the future focus, like a nice place to start to draw us to a close. I was wondering if there are any open tabs you've got of things that you wanted to mention or say, or that you didn't have a chance to get in. It's okay if the answer is no.
I don't think so. One thing you've reminded me of in the conversation is an optimism about people. I think that there's a lurking behind the scenes in this conversation for me has been a kind of notional client, and I like having these conversations because they remind us of the promise in everyone. I think if we can connect with the right people or the right help or the right environment or whatever it might be, I think that's important to remember.
Yeah. James Casey, thank you for joining us on Intelligent Teams.
Been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Intelligent Teams podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Teams Substack. It's intelligentteams.substack.com. You'll receive a free weekly newsletter featuring an episode of this podcast or writings about cognitive science and building intelligent teams. See you next time.